Welcome to Music Crush, a new music podcast hosted by the Flute New Music Consortium. I'm Nicole Reiner.
And I'm Elizabeth Robinson.
If you like the show, please rate and review it on the platforms wherever you listen to podcasts, particularly on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find us and grow the show. And of course, you can learn more about Flute New Music Consortium at flutenewmusicconsortium.com.
Jacob Thiede is a composer and saxophonist from Murray, Kentucky, where the smell of tobacco barns and honeysuckle fill the air. He holds a PhD in music composition from the University of North Texas, where he studied composition with Kirsten Broberg, Panagiotis Kokoris, and Andrew May, and saxophone with Eric Nessler. Currently based in Lake Dallas, Texas, he finds himself as a financial advisor for TIAA. By day, he helps clients with financial planning. By night, he composes, records, and performs with his local community of saxophonists and for his local church. Welcome, Jacob.
Howdy, howdy. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're so excited to catch up with you today. We have been researching you ahead of this interview, and in Nicole's cyberstalking, she found you on UNT's Center for Experimental Music and Intermedia page. Can you tell us a little bit about your work there?
Yeah, when I was there when I was a grad assistant, and it's a great program where they have really thriving culture of composers making music, technologists tinkering. I really had a great time experimenting with electronics there, collaborating with other composers in their music. It really took off a lot of the electronic side. So if you are interested in anything computer music, you should check out SEMI is what we call it, shorthand, but it's part of University of North Texas. I did my doctoral work there, and it's got this insane speaker array that is a sort of pilgrimage that if you're a computer musician, even a performer, you should try to get out there to experience it, because they've really set it out and tried to be pioneers in spatial audio and this three-dimensional aesthetic of music. So not only just, multi-channel, so we're used to 5.1 surround sound or 8 channels, but it's speakers above you and below you and behind you and in all different directions. They fine-tuned it so that composers and musicians can put their music really precisely recreated, if that makes sense. So they're comfortable sharing their music, even though in the environment that they composed in might have been way different. It can be one-to-one to how they like it, if that makes sense. It's very customizable. It's kind of a winter wonderland now. We're approaching Christmas time, but it's really dazzling. It's awesome facility.
Well, it sounds like you had all of the equipment that an electronics composer could ever want or hope to ask for. Do you have a favorite memory or a favorite collaboration from your time?
Well, it was actually in the classroom, and it was with Panagiotis Kokoris, who's also an FMC winner or honorable mention. I can't remember, but one of his pieces is part of the repertoire, and it was in one of his classes that we just tinkered with all sorts of things. We did Arduino making microcomputer sounds. We one of the assignments was to go out to a store, Goodwill, to find those toy instruments that are like Hug Me Elmo or I can't, little keyboards, fake saxophones. They're all purely electronic. So we would get inside, tinker with the circuit board. So see how the circuit board, well, first how it worked, but then second what parts affected the sound and its output. And I remember being not in the hall area, but in the storage closet. And it's this massive storage closet. So we were all 8 of us were inside that classroom, just tinkering with these toy saxophones and toy keyboards and the whole gamut.
Was there a resulting piece for Tickle Me Elmo and instrument that's floating around somewhere?
Oh yeah, I'm sure there is. Yeah, and whether for fun or for really serious kind of study, I'm sure there is, and not for me. I didn't yield, any sort of study from there. Another kind of one that I did create, one output was a piece for just using white noise as a sample source. So it's called Calling You. You can find it on my YouTube, but it is all just white noise samples. And the trick of it is you think of white noise and it's just static and noise, obviously, but it was a lot of fun to be taught how to incorporate that in a sampler and making tones out of it and making really something. At least my efforts were, I was trying to make something really beautiful, simply, and it was like a 3-4 minute piece, and that was a lot of fun too. And getting to hear that back in the hall with all the, like, there's like, there was 3 subwoofers at that time, way more than you need. So hearing like from the low frequency bass to the high frequency tweeters, it was incredible.
School is such an amazing, luxurious time to play
It
around
is.
with things. You were a grad student also when you won honorable mention in our composition competition,
Yeah.
which was a while ago now. What's been going on since then for you? Can you talk about your work composing life balance?
Yeah. I graduated with my PhD from UNT in 2020 at the height of pandemic. We all know. And it's been almost 4 years and we're still talking about it. But it had a huge impact, once in a century event that impacted all of us in some form or fashion. And for me, I graduated and I needed to make ends meet. So I worked in Amazon. I did warehouse work for about a year. So it was, typical $15 an hour, but I got health coverage and dental, so I didn't have to suffer with any cavities, and paid rent. And that was a good time, a unique time, because it was with Amazon, you're typically not allowed to have your phone on the floor. It's a safety hazard, OSHA. But in that time, it was allowed for emergencies, understandably. So a lot of us secretly brought in our phones, but also had earbuds, which you're not also supposed to have. And a lot of us had bandanas that covered our ears, so it was really covert. They started cracking down on that, understandably. But what I did, you're also allowed to have earplugs, because it is a really loud environment. So I got earplug headphones that I could plug into my phone and listen to a lot of podcasts and audiobooks, and it was like a great time for learning for me, after, especially being it was kind of a soft transition, because there were a lot of hiring freezes. For me personally, my wife, her family's in Texas, so we see ourselves here for the foreseeable future. Before I got married, I was going to expand all my resumes and teaching applications, whether that's public school or higher ed, all over the nation, maybe even all over the world. But plans change, and we're here in Texas. Couldn't be happier. So that kind of shifted the career focus for me. Stopped applying for academic positions, went on and got really interested, as a lot of people really did, but it's kind of busted now. It's kind of a boom and bust. It was a big boom, of course, in the stock market and markets in general. Everything, prices of houses, everything went up, so everyone was an expert. So I got really interested in that, and especially being a musician, it's sort of my why now, because I would talk to a lot of friends and colleagues, professors, not necessarily struggled with personal finance, but never really talked about it. It's been much better in recent years. A lot of entrepreneur efforts are being put into place with music, especially with the constant war, you guys know, with academia, with funding for projects, for assistantships. That's good, but in terms of thinking about retirement specifically, that was never really approached or talked about within music. And I think one of the luxuries of music is, when you do it for a living career wise, you kind of plan on doing it for as long as you physically possibly can. So I think that's one of the reasons why we don't really talk about the future, I guess, or retirement.
I never thought about it that way, but
yeah,
that is an assumption, I suppose.
right.
It's like, recognize it.
Absolutely. Like, how long do you plan on working? As long as I can keep on doing what I do. It's not work. So I got really into that, and I started applying to different brokers in the area. I'm in the Dallas Fort Worth area, so and that's another kind of fortunate thing is I grew up in Kentucky, really rural area. My mind is blown by how many opportunities there are to find work in this area that is not so fortunate in different areas of the states. So applied to like Fidelity, applied to Charles Schwab, got some HR interviews, but really never made it past the second round. And then I got this callback from TIAA, the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association, and it just fit like a glove. And but by then I got humbled because I really learned about my interview chops were up because I had been on the kind of interview rounds for about 6 months or so, dressed up over Zoomland in my best suit, and got it. Actually, cut my hair because you can't see it, but I used to have really long hair. Buzzed it all off, chopped it all off, and I just really wanted to kind of get out of Amazon. So I applied. I got into TIA, and it fit like a glove because their primary clientele is professors. So I just had come from that environment where I'm talking with university administration, staff, and then the tenured and adjunct professors. So I've been there since 2021 and started in the call center just as a normal consultant broker, like got licensed and everything. Recently, I just passed the registered advisors exam. So you can find me on SEC's website, and my track record, and everything, past experience, work experience. And so I'm entering in that role with TIA as a financial advisor. And I'm really, really excited about that. And in the meantime, still composing, still performing, and loving that. But career has definitely taken a left turn.
It's funny how often that happens for so many of us. As you were talking, I was thinking about the day that I finished my doctoral comps, or maybe it was my
Mm-hmm.
dissertation defense. I don't remember. It was near the end of the degree program, and my mentor teacher pulled me aside and said, "Okay, so I just want to warn you that it takes most people at least 4 years to get a job after their doctorate." And so she was telling me this as I was trying to leave campus because my defense had made me late for my hourly job at the mall, and I was trying to get to the job that was going to pay rent. But I thought about that 4 year piece of advice a lot when we got to year 5 and 6, and I was
Mm-hmm.
still not doing the academic thing. So I I sort of marvel at how much more complicated the pandemic must have made that for folks like yourself who are
Yeah,
graduating into it or after it had already sort of wrecked the landscape.
I worked with Mark Engebretson during my master's, and he said I didn't get my first tenure job until I was 40. And all right, and that was also a wake up call to me, and I was like 24 at the time. And then funny enough, I kind of studied with Sue Fancher, who was also in Greensboro, kind of by proxy because she was at Duke, and Dr. E was at UNCG. They're this saxophone power couple, and Sue was really also kind of on the other side, was like, because she's just a top tier professional saxophonist, world renowned. And I remember her giving a talk and kind of talking about incorporating the amateur saxophonists, because I think I was at a NASA conference for the North American Saxophone Alliance, and that really encouraged me a lot of, yeah, there is a little bit of a distinction between professional and amateur, but we kind of view amateur as a dirty word, and I think she was on a mission, kind of subtly trying to redeem that word as kind of put it in a very positive light, that it's a very fun thing and a very good thing to be an amateur. Whatever you're at, it doesn't mean that you're bad. It just simply is a kind of a logical yes no. Are you making your primary income source, which is how we are in this day and age. I've been kind of in that track of like, yeah, being an amateur saxophonist, being an amateur composer, and really redeeming that title, and encouraging others that are highly experienced. And it's been very humbling, but it's been very rewarding to have some peace about that, if that makes sense. Not being so much in turmoil, like, oh, my identity is not in music anymore or whatever, but simply enjoying and spreading that joy of music.
I think
love
in
that.
a lot of ways, separating your identity from what you do is healthier. And I absolutely want to come back and talk about that a little bit more if we can. But I'm looking at our list of questions and thinking chronologically. We
Sure.
want to talk a little bit about the FNMC piece. And so I want to do that before we get too sidetracked by everybody's
Yeah.
enthusiasm for the state of affairs in music. So the piece of yours that was named honorable mention was And Everything in Between. And it was one of our first honored flute and electronics works. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was I was writing that at the tail end of my master's, and I worked with Christina Dare, and she was working on her doctoral project for DMA and flute, and her whole project was about flute and light because she was really inspired by a lot of artists that incorporated that as a medium, just simply light, not necessarily lighting, I guess, but yeah, incorporating light or using light as a medium for their creative process. So she consulted a couple of composers, and she said, "There's one thing you need to incorporate. You can do anything you want, but incorporate that visual component of light." And then we were able to just take off with it and run. And that summer, I was really interested in Nico Muley's works. I just had my master's comps, and he was on our list. I have a great deep appreciation for music that leans more towards a postmodernist, modernist style. Home for me is going basically Bach and the Bang on a Can crew, those folks. I don't really like too much classical romantic music, but I love Bach. And then jump 400 years to New York, essentially, and what those folks are doing up there. Loved listening to Nico Muley and anything coming out on New Amsterdam Records at the time. And I did a whole project on kind of trying to study the tonality of how Muley experiments. It was his drones. It was drones for piano and violin. And so the whole piece was about incorporating drones into music and dancing around them. So there would be one pitch throughout the whole movement, and the piano and violinist was dance around it. And so I wanted to capture that harmonically, but not with the conventional 5/1, functional, traditional music theory. So what I did was I tried to track out the spectrum of color onto basically like a sort of spectrum of fifths or circle of fifths. So as we are in more sharp keys, it was on the Roy side of Roy G Biv, and then on the flat side, the Biv was the flat side. So it was this audio visual component. It's on my YouTube page. It's got like 50 views. It's awesome. I love it. I'm glad I did it. It kind of tried to express that visually, what was going on harmonically. So that was on the top of it. It's just solid color with music. And so with And Everything in Between, my light component was about basically going from Roy to violet, red to violet in the spectrum very, very slowly, and kind of having the music slowly revolve around that. There should be a projection in a very dark room. That's kind of like the ideal environment. Everyone has their own, and I'm totally open to how performers, you don't even have to incorporate it. But for that project, my kind of ideal was having a projection on a wall, trying to make it fill the room as much as possible, and have a fog machine maybe, so that you have this kind of interdimensional, taking up the space. It was a lot of fun to write because I had never done anything visual before, and that would inform what I like to explore now and what I want to do now. It was my first kind of Opus 1 using Max MSP and exploring how to do that. I have zero computer coding experience, and I'm truly a beginner in that. And so it was a lot of fun to try to incorporate that. A lot of it is kind of playback, where you trigger a sound file and you play along with it. So I try to make it as free as possible for the performer to kind of have to breathe, essentially, to kind of have a little time between phrases. But at the end of the day, it's still sort of this karaoke. You're playing along with the track, but it's not so strict that like you have in the sheet music okay, you need to be at minute marker 112, minute marker 124. There's a little bit more freedom in that. And then there's some processing to a sort of glorified guitar pedal board for flutes. So it was a ton of fun to write, and I'm so honored and privileged that FNMSC would choose it as an honorable mention. It's gotten a ton of performances by y'all, so I tried to incorporate the performance list on the sheet music, and I've been so poorly organized the last 2 years that I'm a little bit lacking, but it's been an incredible experience to be featured by the Flute Music Consortium.
I don't think I remember seeing anything about a fog machine in the score, so I think I'm gonna have to go back and check that out. That sounds like my
I think
speed.
you're right. I think you're I don't think I even included that because I thought it was too gaudy, maybe.
Oh my gosh, I am getting ideas just sitting here listening to you. Your answer started with Bach and ended up with Max MSP, and there was some talk about color and fog machines in the middle that got me kind of distracted. But I think I remember reading somewhere online that you were interested in grooves and rhythms in metal music. Can you talk a little bit about incorporating that into a otherwise relatively stodgy genre?
Sure, yeah. I grew up, my first musical memory was in sync. My mom and dad bought me a CD. We still had cassette tapes back then, but CDs were, this was like 2000, so CDs were kind of taking over. And so a lot of my upbringing was, my dad is an engineer, my mom's a bookkeeper, kind of accounting, numbers gal. And so, but they were both musical. And so growing up, I heard a little bit of everything. Dad would play Scott Joplin on the piano over and over, Maple Leaf Rag, but also a little bit of Billy Joel. Um, that really influenced a lot of my musical heritage, so to speak. So grew up listening to just kind of what everyone else listens to on the radio, especially again in rural Kentucky. Kind of limited intake in a pre-Spotify world, pre-internet world, just limited what the Walmart CD rack has. And so listened to a lot of local metal too. So I got into that scene, so to speak, because there were house shows and youth center shows, and everyone had their sample mixtapes. Like I just went to the studio. You can buy this off me for $5, and it sounds pretty good. Just love that culture, and so I got really into metal then. Part of my master's thesis was investigating a lot of popular metal bands back that about 10 years ago. So this was probably 2015. August Burns Red and I Wrestled a Bear once. And what really fascinated me was just, I call them the ride rhythms, where they're kind of the equivalent of drones in rhythm, I would say, where you just have a continuous metronome in the back. How do the musicians dance around that? Trying to have like basically a 2 or 3 voice components, kind of like as maybe polyphonic as contrapuntal as rhythm can get. And so having a 4/4 against a 3/4 against a 5/4, something simple like that, but maybe making it a little more complex. And I love that. And I also really have been getting into how those ride rhythms affect our perception of speed and tempo. One thing that you learn in music school is about metric modulation, how maybe like an eighth note triplet can transition to a tempo change that the eighth note triplet equals a quarter note, something like that. So with those ride rhythms, how do you express a different tempo but not changing the tempo marking, if that makes sense? So having 4 quarter notes in a row in 4/4 time, and then transitioning that from a quarter tie to a 16th. So having 5 16th note ride rhythm. In a way, it sounds like the music is slowing down, but you're maintaining the same tempo. So it creates this, that's probably the most virtuosic I ever got with my music. My music is relatively simple and minimalistic. Rhythm is hard, I think, and maybe you guys can speak to that.
I think it depends a lot on the student, but I don't know. As you were talking, I was thinking about, I think we met in person once a million
Yeah,
years
so the
ago.
SCI
Was it
concert.
SCI? I was going to ask
Yeah,
you the
yeah.
master SCI, and I remember you. Was it you that had the piece for
The
pre-recorded
snare drum.
electronics and snare drum that was being
Yeah,
performed?
yeah,
Were
yeah.
you playing with something like this, or like what you're talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah, exactly. It's called At Any Rate. Take your time. And I had a whole series of pieces, a sort of cycle of works called with kind of the subtitle "Take Your Time," and each of them explored those ride rhythms, changing the feeling of a different multiple tempos within one tempo, and then actually doing sudden tempo changes, and accompanied by like kind of the pop music key change where you know shift it up a half step. You know, is it Beyonce? You Got What I Need? That comes to mind. And but doing that with tempo, so going from slower to slower to slower to slower, or going faster and faster and faster, and having a tape or a fixed playback is really easy to do that because it's pre-recorded, so you can just hit spacebar and it does the work for you, and you just have to accompany it or lead it. Yeah, absolutely in the same vein. Yeah, that those ride rhythms and kind of metal grooves. Mm-hmm.
I remember sitting backstage with the musicians I was there with, and I think we had a spare pianist backstage also. And so partway through, they thought they had figured out what pattern you were doing, so they were trying to do air hits when the snare drummer was supposed to do air hits, and
it goes down to like 8 beats per minute or something. And I don't know if that performance had a projection because there was a video of the metronome and you could literally see it go back and forth where it was like 1, 2, 3, 4. So it was absurdly slow, but yeah.
I think that's the part I must remember. We were backstage, so we didn't get the visual. I just remember thinking, like, these guys must be a lot better at understanding rhythm than me because I don't know what's happening. And they're like making air drum strikes as things were happening they thought, and then they'd be like, "Oh, I missed it."
Oh man.
It was one of the more joyous moments of that particular conference, was backstage listening to your snare drum work.
And that's what I miss about academia, just the risks we can take of doing either like, you know, in the moment, you know, we're laughing about it now, like the concepts and such. But back then I was really nervous about doing that and how it would be received. But I took the risk because I was in a comfortable environment to do, you know, that's what's afforded us in academia. I'm glad we can look back with joy on it. But in that time, I was really kind of high anxiety, high fear, but it paid off. And I'm glad you know, looking back, it was a lot of fun to do.
I think if I'd been responsible for creating that performance, I also would have been very high anxiety. But
Yeah, and I'm not the
it was a blast.
performer. I'm just like telling someone else to do this. It's like, and they're like,
Well, shifting gears to yet another medium that makes you the fascinating, multifaceted person that you are. As we were looking you up, we found that your dissertation is called Digital Tap Dance. Tap dance as a medium for composition. Can you give us a Reader's Digest condensed version of that?
yeah, absolutely. So I took this course with Claudia Howard Queen at UNT, and she taught. I think she said that it was like one of 4 programs in the States about choreographers collaborating with dancers, and it's actually where I met my wife, Ari, and she is a tap dancer, but she got her BFA in dance as well, and in that time, we learned a ton about collaborating and the medium in the ways to collaborate with dancers and how to compose it. So I spent a lot of the first section talking about trying to incorporate that and trying to see what historically choreographers have done with dancers, and really it's just the big ballet hitters with Tchaikovsky's ballets going into Copland's ballets, and that's the most time I spend with those 2 composers and the respective choreographers. It's not supposed to be comprehensive by any means, just sort of a here's how they did it, here's how we did it in my class this one time. We did music first, dance second, dance first, music second, simultaneous, things like that. But it was really fascinating to read about the struggles and the letters written back and forth in a pre-technology, I mean, well, pre maybe electronics, you know, world where they're writing by hand to each other. And then after that, I talk about tap dance a little bit, talk about what are different ways that tap dance can create sound. I really worked closely with Ari on how do we talk about the different steps that a tap dancer can do. We really tried to condense it into 10 more common steps and then from there creating rudiments, equivalent of rudiments, that the combination of these 4 steps creates this rudiment. So it's very similar to percussion in that way, and it was a lot of fun to rate, because also what I wanted to do, and what I did was look into previous methods of notation for dance. And there's the 2 that I got into was Laban notation as well as Kahn notation. And for the former, Laban, it's such a fascinating notation. You'll have to, if you're interested, take a look. And there's tons of resources. And there's actually a software that was made to create your own compositions in Laban notation, kind of similar to Finale or MuseScore or Sibelius, that you can insert in time, and with a sort of bar lines, different movements. And I actually composed a piece with Laban notation for bare feet on amplified wood, and I need to revisit that and edit it, but it was a lot of fun to make. It was fun to perform it. It never got performances because of COVID, and by that time I was in the workforce. That was one thing, was Laban notation was a big work and study on how to compose for that and how to guide other composers to do that. And then additionally, after that, were a couple pieces for tap dance, so for shoes with metal taps on them. So the 2 pieces that were really successful in my mind were a piece for computer and tap dancer, where there's a software called Ableton Live. I was able to create and creatively code this plugin that listened to the tap dancer tap and would adjust the tempo when the tap dancer wanted to. The idea was to control with the Nintendo Switch Joy-Con that you can connect with Bluetooth. You can literally just press the buttons to start and stop the listening back. And so you can adjust the tempo, going back to the kind of study in tempos and ride rhythms. So you could either tap slower and have different breaks. It's kind of like a tap tempo, a glorified tap tempo. And so the piece would slow down and the playback would slow, because it was on loops. It would slow down. And then simultaneously, if you want to do quicker taps, it would speed up, and the piece would speed up and the playback would speed up. So that was a ton of fun. That's, videos on YouTube. If you want to listen to it, watch it. And then second was a sort of chamber small concerto in one movement for tap dancer and a small ensemble. And at that time at UNT, we had formed this makeshift new music ensemble called New Atmospheres. And it was this hodgepodge of double bass with viola, violin, neon saxophone, clarinet, piano, and bassoon, bass clarinet. It was a lot of fun. And so it was basically a bigger Perot ensemble, which was a lot of fun. And so there was audio playback, and it was a metronome. So it started off at, I think, really slow. I think that one started at like 10 beats per minute, maybe like 4 beats. So really like abstract. Like it was at that point just kind of like just to do it. So where one beat, like on a practical level, it started at quarter equals 40. One beat would play every 4 beats. So one little like tone would play every 4 beats. It was like conceptually that slow. And it would cello rondo to quarter equals 120, and then D cello rondo all the way back to the starting tempo. And so it was this one big like tempo shift. And around it, there were different sections the tap dancer would accompany, and we never really got quite to the tap dance part. There was like kind of like a rough draft, but we never got to the choreography because it's about a 15-minute piece altogether. COVID happened. The last thing we're thinking about is music, really.
I'm excited to learn about maybe some future projects from you in a few minutes here, but I would love to jump back to the financial side of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have a Patreon account, which I had only previously ever heard of for podcasts. And I thought it looked really interesting and really creative. How do you use it, and what got you turned on to it?
So it's been lacking in the last since I got the jobs with but what I did with it
Sure.
was basically sort of a low key commission where if you were subscribed to it for a certain amount of time, I would write for you a piece. Laura Pillman helped me out with that, and I composed her a piece during pandemic. I composed, I think in that time, probably 3 or 4 pieces I sent, or movements of a piece. There's 5 total. I need to send that 5th one and then some fixed audio. So she helped me out with that first year. She sort of did a trial and error for me. And it was a lot of fun to compose for her because her what she wanted to do was like a looper pedal. And so composing for her for that, for what she wanted. And so I guess in a perfect world, I would love for people to be subscribed on Patreon, like maybe $20 a month. I think it was like a tier, like it was like $20 a month, maybe it was $12 a month that I would compose for you, maybe like a small piece every month. Now you get a lot of people, that adds up. So it's kind of understandable, like why maybe composers don't really use it. But I got really turned on to it by, I think in during the pandemic, all creators were really going to it for one form or another. So a lot of YouTubers and kind of behind the scenes editing videos, and then podcasters, of course, like you said, Nicole, like where you would get a secret episode or you would get a episode early. And so never quite got it figured out. And maybe one day, it's still active, maybe one day trying to really be put on that entrepreneurial spirit. I'm not inclined on that, but who knows, where I reach out to performers and say, hey, if you subscribe, I for a year I can do it. But it gets really fuzzy because you can cancel at any time. There's this weird back and forth, a lot. That's why a lot of services say, hey, you need to pay for a full year up front. You get the services if you want them for 12 months. There's a lot of kinks and stuff to iron out. But I would love to see if there's a possibility to have this sort of subscriber model for composers and performers to interact with each other, to get exclusive stuff, or just as a form for commissions, even if they're just miniatures.
That's a really cool idea. Yeah, maybe Patreon is sort of for musicians trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe musicians just need to create their own version of it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
really cool.
absolutely. So
Also, along financial lines, as you were talking before about your work in the financial planning world, do you have any tips for the struggling artists out there who might be listening? Because I think you're right. We almost get discouraged from talking about the practicalities of money, but you do have to eat.
yeah. Yeah, I'd say just kind of it depends on your personality ultimately. For me, I love to stay curious, and if the person I'm talking to has that kind of spirit about them. I was talking with my dad, and he's an engineer professor. So he has academia experience too, working in engineering, teaching engineering, albeit like more math, less. It's still creative. He's still like sending me pictures of like his gliders. He makes these styrofoam planes, to enter into competitions. But we were talking actually this weekend, and he said, because I was like, I don't know if I want to do finance for the rest of my career. I don't know if I want to do a traditional 30-year kind of deal. Maybe a 10-year. Maybe that's my pattern of doing 10 years in music and then I step away, 10 years in finance, and then 10 years maybe doing something else. And he said that, that's not how it was in my age. But I see that things have radically changed, and I think I can confidently say you can do that, and a lot of your peers can do that too, just because as we get into the generations, a lot of the working class now and the universities are stepping away, or just generally whatever field you're in, there's a big gap to fill. So there will be opportunities for everyone, but it will still be difficult. Like, don't, this is big brain stuff that's way beyond me. There are problems that come in when there are gaps to be filled, but with that said, there are opportunities that folks in their kind of mid-career range between the 30s and 50s are able to fill in gaps where folks in their 70s and 80s are retiring now. So so keeping an open mind and being interested in a ton of stuff at once, seeing if it's viable. For me, I'm not a coder, I'm not an engineer, but I got so many of my peers that are going into creative coding worlds, and I would have never thought that. And then I would have never thought that I would be on the phones talking to people about money, for a living, and being paid comfortably for it. Who knows what's going to happen in the next 5 years? But I'd say just stay curious and really, yeah, don't underestimate your hobbies and your interests. Don't try to don't just discard them, but really let them flourish and grow them like your flower that you love, your plants that you love, water them and nurture them. And yeah, I'll get off that soapbox.
That is not the financial advice I was expecting to hear, but that's fascinating. I mean, like, that's a very creative way to approach what might feel like a very pedantic topic. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You talked a little bit earlier about sort of separating your professional life from maybe your creative side, which is something that probably Nicole and I both talk with students a lot about. And I remember I heard many aspects of my own journey in your story. I remember a brief time where I had a desk job and really struggled to balance the obligations of my day-to-day with maybe what I wanted to be doing creatively. It sounds like you're doing a little bit of that. And if you're doing any, you're being more successful than I was. Can you talk a little bit about how you sort of toggle between those two worlds, or how that works for you?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like what grad school and school in general really taught me, and I hope teaches others, to identify what resistances you have and what kind of stops you from doing things. And if that's and then from there filtering out, okay, is there a good reason why that it's preventing me from doing it, or do I need to get beyond it, or do I just kind of need to go a different route or a different door that's open? And I think what school taught me to do was kind of identify those three tools when you're met with resistance. And so when I was in undergrad in music school, I really tried to fight through resistance, and I found some success and a lot of unsuccess. And then that second, of just outright like choosing to not go down a certain path because that resistance, like, that's just not you. And then that last one, finding another door, I think that's where you kind of sit in, and maybe your musical maturity, that's kind of like the final leaf of like, okay, you've identified kind of what resistances are in your life, and you identify what works well with you, and instead of trying to swim upstream, you one river, you are going to swim downstream another river. And that's that final branch of maturity, of finding those rivers that you don't have to fight all the time upstream, and just flow down the ones that really work with you. And so in this day and age, I just have my twins. I want to compose some lullabies for them, and so I want to compose, and then something really short but also really like unique to me that I want to kind of put my stamp on. And so using the modern technology like Facebook and Instagram Reels, TikTok, 1 minute, little clips, 1 minute, 2 minute clips. And so that was a lot of fun. I did that. So I composed a lot of piano pieces for that. I think it's in 12 parts right now. And that's not on my YouTube, but it's on my Instagram, where you can kind of check out those different lullabies. And they're not necessarily for babies right now. It's more for them. I'm more kind of thinking for them when they're like 18 and 19, when they're like adults. I really would like to think that they would appreciate them. So not functional at all. Like maybe it would put some babies to sleep, but depends on the baby. And it's more for me to, for my future 18-year-old, this is music is for you, and I hope you like it, down the road. So things like that, trying to really swim downstream and just do things I want to do and are easy for me to do, and and identifying what works for me.
Oh, that makes a ton of sense. It sounds wonderfully
Yeah.
well adjusted. Maybe that's why
Yeah.
you're being more successful than I was. In that vein, and a question we've been asking near the end of almost every interview we've done this season, any dream collaborations? Like if somebody called you tomorrow and said, hey, we want you to work on XYZ and it'll be with person ABC, who's calling and what do they want you to do?
I don't know. I think the one thing on top of mind is spaces, and I went with TIAA. They had a refitted. They used UNC Charlotte's old campus, and they have this big hall that's like 5 floors tall, lots of reverb, and so that's really piqued. I went there about a week or two ago, and that's really piqued my interest back to kind of science of sound classes I took, of capturing a space, and what you get in music technology that I'm sure you both have really messed with is convolution reverb in your mixes. The engineer can put in a specific place that your recording can, if this is how you would sound, you record in a dry environment, like a small studio recording, and this is how you would sound like in this cathedral, and this is how you'd like to sound in this hall. And I think maybe my dream project would be like an architect coming to me, and he or she being like, you can do whatever you want, but I'll make it beautiful. You just tell me what you want. And so I don't know, like as maximally reverberant but minimal occupation of a space as possible is really interesting to me. So something that would be accessible in a sort of kind of midtown environment where people can come in, use it for recording or like events or anything like that. Basically writing pieces about reverb. That's probably my dream collaboration.
Last piece we always like to ask. Can you please tell us 3 pieces of music, any genre, that you'd like us to explore?
What I'm listening to now is the Bach, the 16 Concerti, after other composers. I don't know if you guys have heard those, but I believe it's number 10 in D minor. Movement 2 is just this gorgeous, simple. You wouldn't even really think it was Bach. You would hear some remnants of Bach, but I think these 16 pieces he knew of other composers. When you're taught about Bach, you're taught he didn't move beyond a such and such circle around his town in Germany, or what was Germany at that point. So you don't really think of Bach as like well traveled or even really well informed. And then he composed for church and a lot of church pieces, but these 16 Concerti are after. Maybe he transcribed it, I think. I don't, I'm just confused by it, but I listened to it. I stumbled upon it on Spotify, and it listed Bach as a composer, but it's the 16 Concerti by Bach or transcribed by Bach. So that's what I've been really listening to. And then listening to a lot of King's Kaleidoscope. There's this podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and I was really impacted positively and negatively by that church. And I really love that podcast, kind of exposing a lot of the pitfalls of mega churches, especially Mars Hill. And King's Kaleidoscope they're a band that came out of that church, and they're just this really creative music group that have a lot of hope. While a lot of the stuff was being uncovered, they had every right to walk away from everything. Just the amount of hope that they have in their music was really encouraging to me after such a really awful kind of environment at that church. So that's number 2. And then number 3, let's do Nico Muley, Drones. I don't know. And then I'm listening to a lot of New Amsterdam records. That's Sarah Kirkland Snyder's project. And then I love her music too. So I would say probably New Amsterdam records, that whole crew. They're kind of like that uptown, downtown vibe in the Northeast, New York and New Jersey.
Well, that's awesome, Jacob. It was so great to catch up with you and to hear where you've been and what you've been up to. Thanks for joining us.
Likewise, it's an honor. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Music Crush. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also support the podcast, read show notes, and learn more about FNMC by visiting www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com.